Hey, folks, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is going to be amazing. It's a topic I've been wanting to explore forever and a doc I've wanted to have on this show for even longer. His name is Dr. Bruce Hoffman, and we're going to talk about mast cell activation syndrome, cellular membrane stability, and everything associated with it. So imagine a condition that affects virtually every organ, eludes the standard diagnostic criteria. This is where people get gaslit all the time, and causes multi-system inflammation. Meet the perplexing world of mast cell activation syndrome, otherwise known as MCAS. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bruce Hoffman to discuss this complex condition and explore the critical role of mast cells in our immune system. Mast cells are our body's first line of defense against foreign invaders, allergen and environmental toxins. However, they can become hyperactive in response to triggers like environmental toxins, heavy metals, mold, and even early developmental trauma. And we talk about that in the episode. This can ultimately lead to a cell danger response, which essentially sends the body into a protective shutdown. And if this is you, you might be that person that seems to react to everything. Dr. Hoffman is amazing. He's just the kindest, most knowledgeable, unbelievable guy. He's board certified, has a fellowship in anti-aging medicine, as well as a master's degree in clinical nutrition. He is also a certified functional medicine practitioner. In addition to his clinical training, Dr. Hoffman has studied with many of the leading mind, body, and spiritual healers of our times, including people like Deepak Chopra, Paul Lowe, Osho, Ramesh Balsekar, and John Kabat-Zinn, who wrote the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Great book. Highly recommend you read that. Dr. Hoffman specializes in complex medical conditions, and he is the medical director of the Hoffman Center of Integrative Medicine in Alberta, in Canada, in Calgary, in Alberta, in Canada. And so to learn more about Dr. Hoffman, or to reach out to him if you think that you might want to talk to him about something that's going on in your world, you just need to go to the hoffmancenter.com. We'll put that in the show notes. And that's HOFFMAN Center, CENTRE.com. And that's the website. And you can find out about all the amazing things that they do there. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please make sure that you share it with your friends in your network if you get value from it. And of course, if you're feeling inspired, leave us a review. And that's it. Let's get into it with Dr. Bruce Hoffman. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Dr. Bruce Hoffman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we are gathered here today. We're going to explore, let's say, the universe or the world of MCAS. I mean, there's many other things I know you could speak to, but MCAS being mast cell activation syndrome, which is, in good company with one of the most vexing kind of health issues that people deal with. And I think in part because it's not well understood. It's very disruptive to people who suffer with it. And it's tough to get a diagnosis. And even if you get a diagnosis, it's really hard to figure out how to stabilize those little mast cells. So I thought maybe we could start with explaining to people what the heck a mast cell is and why we even need them, because, let's just get rid of the buggers if they're overactive.
That would be nice.
It would be a huge mistake, but
Yeah, we just die a lot quicker.
Exactly. You wouldn't suffer, but
you
maybe would. But okay, well, let's talk about mast cells and what they do.
Sure. So, what mast cells are part of the innate immune system, and they provide protection against invading toxins. So they send out, they're about 1% of your white cells. So they're not a huge component, but they're on all the surfaces of your tissue. They're in your eyes, your skin, your GI tract, your lungs. And they send out up to 1,000 mediators of inflammatory substances in order to protect you from further toxic load.
Wow.
And in so doing, they create a huge sort of multi-symptom, multi-system array of symptomatology. And in every single organ system of the body, if you look at Dr. Afrin, who's one of the pioneers in this work, if you look at his there's a chapter he has in one of his books, he lists all the organs and all the symptoms. That's every single symptom in the book, really, in every single organ can be potentially a mast cell activation issue.
Wow.
So patients who present with mast cell activation, they go from pillar to post, from specialist to specialist, trying to find out why they don't feel well with waxing and waning symptoms over a lifetime, usually. And they never get diagnosed. They never get appropriately diagnosed because it's not just allergy, it's inflammation with or without allergy. So you can have inflammation and not have the IgE allergy typical symptomatology like rhinitis or asthma or urticaria or any of the IgE true allergy type symptoms. But you can be massively inflamed from mast cell activation and have various symptoms that just evade normal diagnostic criteria.
Right. Yeah. So how does someone tell if they have inflammation, just inflammation, or if their inflammation is linked back to their mast cells?
Well, it's a high index of suspicion, really. People who present with mast cell activation syndrome, they've been, I've been sick for as long as I can remember. I had allergies as a child. I've been food intolerant. I've got unexplained anxiety and insomnia that won't go away. And I've got eczema or skin rashes that won't respond. I've got poor wound healing abilities. I've got growths and nodules on my skin that seem to grow, cherry angiomas that seem to come and go because mast cells release growth factors that create little skin growths and skin tags and angiomas and things. So there's this multitude ways of presenting. And if you don't really have a high index of suspicion, you can often miss the diagnosis.
Wow. Okay.
They also react to all the supplements. They react to all the foods. They react to stress.
I mean, I've spoken to people who can't take a supplement. Like they can't, we get them in our group, like they're like, I can't take any supplements. I'm down to 4 foods. I just don't know what to do anymore.
Saw a patient today, 4 foods, can't take anything.
Like, what is that? That's insane.
Insane.
It's insane. So what do we think? Is there any theory about what causes these mast cells to go haywire? Like, I mean, this is clearly not normal. This is not the way that they're intended to work. Like, it's almost like an autoimmune thing, right? It's an immune system gone into overdrive. So what do we think might be driving mast cells into the state of hypervigilance or hyperactivity?
Well, we live in a world that is somewhat overwhelming in terms of its capacity to invade our defenses. We really have no idea how vulnerable we are to food, mental, environmental toxins, and how our body is just struggling to survive and keep abreast of this incoming wave of toxicity. And it's really overwhelming. And it's not hyperbole. It's not conspiracy theory. It's real.
Yeah.
We just aren't adjusted at this moment in our evolution to put up with all the microplastics and heavy metals and insecticides and pesticides and EMFs and mental stresses and bosses that demand things of us. And, it's endless, the toxic load. And mast cells are trying to keep up. They're trying to just protect you from going into this inflammatory response that then shuts down your body in the so-called cell danger response. Or if you look at the Piaget's autonomic polyvagal theory, the dorsal vagal response, where you shut yourself down to withdraw you from life so you don't keep exposing yourself to the things that are incoming.
So it's a protective mechanism.
It's like it's the infantrymen on the battleground trying to say, hey, I'm going to protect you to make sure you don't die. But in the meantime, we're going to wreak havoc with your organ system.
We're shutting it down.
We're pulling you out of life. Stop doing it.
Yeah.
We're
so, which is a problem.
Mitochondria, going to crash your mitochondria. We're going to produce a fatigue state, so you can't get up and keep doing what you've been doing. That's how it works. The Robert Naviaux's cell danger response is absolutely clinically relevant. If all those people are watching and listening, if they aren't familiar with Robert Naviaux's theory of the cell danger response, I would highly recommend they get up to speed immediately on his work, which has been going on for 10 years now, which he has carefully put together through multiple research papers, saying that, when the mitochondria, the canaries in the coal mine, you've got these cells, we've got 70 trillion cells. Inside each cell, we've got, 100 to 2,000 mitochondria. Mitochondria drive the ATP. We produce like 70 kilograms of ATP a day. It's like ATP is it. It's it. And mitochondria, they're the most sensitive to this whole incoming onslaught. And as soon as they detect an overload of stresses, they change their outer membrane, they change their phospholipid structure, they change their voltage, and they literally undergo autophagy and die. And they take it with them, And mast cell activation is one of the ways in which mitochondria get destroyed. Mast cell, the mediators of inflammation. And they get triggered by all the factors, the chemicals, the metals, and the mold.
So let's talk about all of those triggers, right? So, you've named now, so there's the environmental toxins. So there's the mold, there's the heavy metals, there's the pollutants in the air, there's non-native EMFs that you mentioned as well, which some people seem to be more sensitive to than others, but anybody who thinks they're not being affected by them, I used to be one of those people. I used to be like, oh, I'm immune to EMFs, until I was presenting at an event that happened to be in the middle of a field in Kentucky, where you couldn't so much as get a cell phone response, like a cell phone signal in this place. And my Aura Ring kept working because I just wore it, but the nights were so cold and it was rainy and uncomfortable, and my HRV scores were off the charts.
Yeah.
And I was like, and it was the first time probably the first time I'd been away from the soup that we live in. And I was just like, whoa, that's nuts. Like, you don't know your body's responding to something because it's become your new normal. Like, this is just how you are.
Adjust to it, yeah. Interestingly, mast cell activation works. EMFs trigger mast cells to create these inflammatory mediators, which open up the ionic receptors in the cell membrane, which increase intracellular calcium, which increases intracellular glutamate, which is neuroexcitatory and neurostimulatory. So EMFs stimulate mast cell activation. That's how they work.
Wow.
That's how they wreak havoc. Interestingly, just on that point, I recently went to South Africa, where they have load shedding.
They have what?
Load shedding. Every 4 hours, they shut off electricity to certain parts of the country.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah, so I'm in Cape Town, and every 2 or 3 hours, electricity goes off, dead. And interestingly, the people around me with EMF sensitivity were having the time of their life. They felt so relaxed. So the whole country's in crisis because you can't get electricity. But the people with EMF saying, this is heaven, I want to move here.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. It's crazy and hilarious. Okay, so what do we do? So, look, EMFs is the big nut, right? Because you cannot remove yourself from EMF. And so is it possible, and I'm just literally asking you this, we've mentioned all these different toxins. Is it possible that by reducing other toxins in the body, by reducing that overall toxin load, we can help to rebuild some resilience so that the EMFs aren't as dramatic?
Yes and no. So people who are electromagnetic hypersensitive will always tend to be, electromagnetic sensitive, but you can definitely lower the threshold. So, if I look at the major stresses for mast cell activation, number one that trumps it, early developmental trauma.
Interesting. Yeah.
It trumps it 100% of the time due to the dysregulated HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline axis. those individuals are very susceptible to mast cell activation. And that pathway has been well worked out. High cortisol, adrenaline triggers mast cell release. So early developmental trauma with ongoing stresses, mental stresses. Number 2 would be mold. Mold is a massive trigger of mast cell activation. And then number 3 is food. High histaminic, high, inflammatory foods. Those are the top 3 in my world. Then we go look for all the rest, the metals, the chemicals, the infections, and everything else. Right. The gut dysbiosis, the microbiome triggers, yeah.
Yeah, it always comes down to those same things. Okay, so it is crazy, right? As I interview different people, we're talking about different issues. So often it just comes right back to all these things. And the early developmental, those ACEs, people call it ACEs, that early developmental trauma is so, again, it's underreported. It's even under-acknowledged, I think, by individuals themselves, right? It's
gaining momentum. I mean, I don't think you can take a good medical history without doing an ACE score, even though the ACE score isn't it. There's much more to it. The thing that we look for mostly is interrupted bonds with the mother.
Interesting.
That's the key. When there's interrupted bonds with the mother, the HPA axis is usually quite dysregulated, and that system's in trouble. And this is, and it's all unconscious dynamics. If you don't do a family constellation where you look into the unconscious dynamics and entanglements of family systems, you won't know that it's that potent an issue. Then you look at heart rate variability and see if they tweaked in the sympathetic dominance. And then you look at QEEGs, looking at brain waves to see if they have dysregulation between the different delta, theta, alpha, and beta brain waves. And you can tell these systems that are so dysregulated. And we do stress assessments looking for physical stress based on mental triggers. And the first thing I do with every mast cell activation patient is look at these parameters and suggest and insist that they learn self-regulation as the primary strategy before they even address the rest of it. If these individuals aren't self-regulating and having the capacity to move between sympathetic and parasympathetic, because you heal in that coherent zone between the two. Yeah. If they're permanently in fight, flight, or collapse, don't even begin your work with the rest of it. Get them to self-regulate.
Yeah.
Over and over and over every day, like working your biceps, morning, night, every hour. It takes 9 months to a year to shift the neuroplasticity modules in the brain and to shift the default mode network that creates your sense of self. It's a lot of work. Yeah. Nobody wants to do it.
Yeah. No, everybody wants it. But wait. Surely there's a drug or a supplement I could take. That would be so much easier than breathing or this coherent business. So what are the tools? You're laughing. I know. Listen, we all want the easy answer. And sometimes
human nature.
It actually is an easy answer. It just takes time and work and application. So what have you found to be the best tools? And I'm sure it varies from person to person, because I mean, I even find, we're all in a world where we're in sympathetic state. So even without MCAS, we're trying to help people to figure out how they're going to get themselves out of this constantly activated state. And I've found that what works for one doesn't resonate for the other.
Very, very individualized. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first thing we start with is we start with even good old heart math M-wave training.
Love heart math.
We use that. Then we use neurobiofeedback. We use neurofeedback. We use about 6 different strategies of neurofeedback: mind lift, brain tap, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Then we do vagal tone strengthening with Resimax and other devices. And if that's not helpful, we then refer to SE practitioners to do somatic work to assist people in building a window of tolerance, whereby they can stay somewhat stabilized in the world of incoming stresses, and they don't disintegrate and degranulate mast cell at the first sign of something that they can't handle. That is the core of treating mast cell in my world, in the world I work with. if that isn't enough, and usually it is enough to begin the process of then building back up. But that's where we begin, is self-regulation, neurobiofeedback, building a window of tolerance, building self-regulation, coherence, so that they're not so disintegrate. They don't fall apart as easily.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a lot of work. It can be a lot of work.
Well, I mean, when you're talking about early developmental trauma, you're talking about a broken bond, disrupted bonds with mom when they were babies. Like, we're talking about deep, deep work here. Like, this isn't just, I'm gonna learn how to do a box breath and everything's gonna be great. Box breath might be helpful, but this is so interesting, right? Because it takes a physiological condition into the realm of mental health. The
interesting thing, Natalie, is that, we have this Cartesian body-mind split, which we know is not true. But the body-mind is one thing. There's no separation.
Yeah.
There isn't a body and a mind. There's one phenomena, and those two are equal.
Yeah.
So whatever your internal dialogue is from your early developmental or inherited family trauma, you can act out your grandmother's grief. Yeah. So inherited trauma, early developmental trauma, if you don't try and create some conscious insight into what actually happened and what you've inherited and what's not yours to act out, you can't begin the process of down-regulation, because I work in these layers and levels of healing, from, the so-called self or soul, down to mind and ego, down to emotion, down to brain and energetics, down to biology and structure, down to toxicology and the external environment. If you don't heal at the higher levels, which trickle down to biology, you can't go at biology.
No,
because all of this is impeding it's impeding the flow of electrons. And
and you're hanging on, right? Like the body's hanging on to stuff and it won't let go. Almost.
Unconscious dynamics of entanglement can ruin your life, and you won't even know it, because it's before memory was developed at the age of 3 or 4.
Yeah.
So you need somebody skilled in how to interpret family systems, inherited trauma and early developmental trauma, and apply it to physiology and practice. You need somebody very well trained in that, who can really lead you through that and put you into a practical approach on how to manage it.
Yeah. So, but now everybody that presents with MCAS doesn't necessarily have that early childhood trauma.
No,
and but your going in position is most, if not all, people still have some degree of a regulation issue in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.
Almost always, yeah. Which then translates into the gut through the vagus nerve, of course. So they get gut dysmotility and all sorts of dysautonomias of the vagal tone. Then they get, we have these triads and pentads. Symptoms go together. We've got the mast cell activation, POTS, hypermobility people.
The EDS people.
There's a triad. You see them a lot together, Then you get a pentad, where you get dysautonomia and you get autoimmune disease. That's the pentad.
So that adds on to the first 3. Yeah.
They go around like a water in a sort of drain. They swirl around each other, and the one precedes the other, and then they just sort of feed off each other. And the phenotype that presents, often females age 15 to 45, is a very common phenotype of people presenting in that way. Much more hypermobile, much more mycel, much more potsy. A lot of POTS, a lot of dysautonomia.
Yeah. So, but with EDS, which is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, for those of you listening who don't know what EDS is, that's a genetic condition, is it not?
Not necessarily. There's different subcategories of Ehlers-Danlos. Ehlers-Danlos, sort of hypermobile type 3, there's no particular genetics that drive it. There's just a predisposition to it. But there are genetic Ehlers-Danlos conditions, of course, yeah.
Well, these people who just don't make collagen, or they don't make it efficiently, or they don't make enough, or they don't make a certain type. I mean, I have a friend, I didn't know anything about EDS. And I mean, this is a woman who literally had to have all of the teeth pulled out of her mouth because they were just breaking. Like her body wasn't forming the connective tissue to hang on to them. Like it's pretty intense at its most extreme.
You ask people, are you dizzy when you stand up?
That's
do you
POTS,
get palpitations? Do you get nausea and vomiting without any real cause? And that's the POTS sort of symptom. Then you do the 10-minute standing test, looking at blood pressures and pulses. And then the other one is you just do on Zoom, to do the Beighton score, Right. Can you bend your thumb on here? Can you bend your finger back? Let me look at your elbow. It takes 30 seconds.
Yeah. And
done. Then you see they got hypermobile, they got POTS, and then the mast cell symptoms are they're just inflamed and allergic and urticaria and angioedema and allergy symptoms and runny nose, runny eyes, seasonal allergies, joint pain.
And so for these people, still we start with the autonomic regulation. Always. Especially. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's whole programs now built around it, the DNRS and the Gupta and this and that. But I don't find them deep enough, quite frankly.
You don't? Interesting. Well, I guess especially if there's ACE. I mean, if there's early childhood trauma, they're not going to go there.
Because it implies it's sort of an intellectual imposition over an unconscious dynamic. And you need to make unconscious dynamics conscious.
Right.
You only heal through consciousness. You don't heal by just slapping things on people.
No.
Take this, take that, do this, go do.
Yeah. Well, it adds more stress to the system to some degree.
And with, you can't change a negative thought by thinking a positive thought. That doesn't work.
Well, not at that point, you can't.
The unconscious dynamic needs to be looked at, understood, and transformed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
so you need consciousness to unravel some of these entities. Yeah.
Okay, so step one is identifying that indeed a person is dealing with MCAS, which presents, I think the people with the worst cases of MCAS know at this point. They have a constellation of symptoms that are inexplicable and unresolved. They don't respond to anything, right? Or they respond badly to things they should respond well to. So once we've hopefully gotten to a point where we've helped them to regulate their nervous system, because nobody's going to do it for them, right? Like this is really helping in the individual tap into their own ability to self-regulate.
Understand the unconscious dynamics and self-regulate and know why they're self-regulating. If you don't explain the reason, if you don't provide salience, you are doing these exercises for this reason, because you want to end up over here, but you're now over here. To get you this way, it's like going to the gym. You have to practice and you have to get feedback and you have to check in with your provider to see if you're making progress with self-regulation. You don't just say, oh, you need to meditate and do box breathing. No. You create relevance and you link it and you measure it and you see progress. That's has to be sort of supervised and with feedback.
Well, you're rewiring the brain, right? And you're essentially trying to overcome the dominance of your inner Darth Vader, who's basically saying, dude, I'm just trying to keep you alive. You don't understand.
Yeah.
And that's the toughest one to rewire, because it's the big bully that hides behind, I'm just trying to keep you alive. You just don't know what's good for you.
Right. And we have our default mode network, which creates our sense of self. We have our internal dialogue. We have our defense structures. We have all these things in place that often keep us from knowing what the hidden dynamics are. We are very sophisticated entities with lots of slippery sort of corners, and it's not linear. It's not, we trained in N squared, D squared medicine. Name of disease, name of drug, single organ, single drug. It is completely without merit when you come to complex illness, when you're trying to do whole person healing. It has, the cupboard is bare. There is nothing to offer.
Well, which is what happens to these people, right? They're desperate. I mean, I see them in my Facebook community. By the time they show up there, they've tried everything. They've been everywhere. They've been told that they're crazy half the time.
90% of the time, put on an SSRI and referred to the psychiatrist.
Yeah, which is almost the answer, but not quite. I mean, we're at least we're going to the head, but we're not doing it with the right intention. Okay, so once we help, as you help, so now you also named mold, high histamine foods. These are things that that I'm guessing you're addressing while you're helping this person to do this work, right? Because
they take a history of mold exposure, which is almost in every case there. Although mold is it's hidden.
It's everywhere.
So it's everywhere. So there's different ways to measure mold illness, and there's simple, quick ways which everybody falls into the trap. They do a urine mycotoxin test. They say, I got mold illness. No, that's not mold. That's not chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is a mold inflammatory condition. You've got urine mycotoxin. It doesn't mean you've got SIRS. SIRS is the real diagnosis. You've got you got to take a history. You got to fail the visual contrast test. You got to look at the cytokines. You've got to look at the IgL test for the intracellular mold species and the mycotoxins. Yes, you can do a urine mycotoxin test, but that is not diagnostic. It's just indicative of a possibility. You've got to do Hermes or Hertzsmead-2s in the home. You've got to measure mold spores. There's a lot to making a diagnosis of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which, by the way, is closely linked to mast cell.
I was going to say, like, they're kind of frickin' frack, the two of them, right? Because they feed off each other.
Mold's a terrible trigger of mast cell. Terrible trigger. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And it doesn't mean mold in this home. It could be the mold that you were in 3 homes ago that's still in your system that hasn't been bound up and excreted.
So are there people that are more susceptible to that kind of thing?
Yes.
Like that, I know genetically there's genes that show that you might be more, like some people just, their body can't clear it somehow.
Yeah, Richard Shoemaker developed all the genetics around mold toxicity and the inability to clear mold. So there is a genetic predisposition. Only 25% of the population are so-called mold sensitive. I don't think that figure is correct. I think it's much more.
Well, there's probably other genes somewhere that we just don't, there's so much we don't know in genetics.
But the spouse of a mold patient will go, what's wrong with you? I don't see mold. I don't feel mold. I'm fine. What's wrong with you? But then the poor wife is 25%. The husband's part of the 75%. They don't crash with mold, but the child or the wife's on the floor with mold exposure. And it doesn't make any sense because it's a hidden toxin most of the time.
For sure.
Then you go scratching, and then you find it behind the drywall. You find it in the dishwasher. You find it behind the washing machine.
In the washing machine, in that rubber thingamabobby.
Right there. Lift up the toilet along the ball that.
Well, you smell. I mean, I smell mold. I will walk into a place and smell it, and my husband will be like, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I'm like,
not everybody smells it, but those who do, they train dogs to smell for it.
I'm like that dog. I smell mold and I taste rancid oils. Other people are like, I don't understand why you don't like this. I'm like, dude, this peanut butter or almond butter is rancid. And they look at me like I'm crazy. And I look at them like, I'm so sorry for you that your taste buds are dead.
Yeah, you can smell mold. It's musty for sure. Yeah, some people can anyway.
So do binders help in a situation like that?
Oh, absolutely they do. But the common error, once again, there's many errors that get made in this holistic functional world of ours. People get, they go down the mold. Oh, I've got mold. Well, mold may be one of your triggers, but let's look for everything else as well.
Sure.
Mold's a big trigger. And if you do have mold and you do have inflammation from mold and you have chronic inflammatory response syndrome from mold and your mitochondria have undergone cell death because of mold, then you do have to remove yourself, clean up, do remediation, and you use binders. But what is taught is you use cholestyramine as one of the primary binders. But cholestyramine is highly absorbent of all the fats and oils. So if you don't check their fatty acid status and you go throw cholestyramine as a binder, that person's going to crash in front of your eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that's, I mean, that the cholesterol, it's funny, I have a box of it sitting there and I haven't touched it because I just kind of, it's one of those ones where I'm like, I'm not so sure it's worth the downside. I'd rather take a whole lot of other stuff. And I don't know.
It also depends what mycotoxin you're secreting, whether cholestyramine is going to be of benefit.
Effective. So you really have to do that testing to figure out what is at play here.
It's best for the ochratoxins, but what I do is I do the Body Bio Kennedy-Krieger fatty acid test, and that measures all your omega-6s, all your omega-3s, all your omega-9s. It measures your demyelination of your fatty acids. And you can see if your total lipid count is below -30, don't touch cholestyramine. You're going to crash that patient.
Interesting. Okay.
So I use the Body Bio fatty acid test as one of my primary tests that I use.
Oh, no, I didn't realize they had one. I just, there's another company that does an omega fatty acid test, but I don't know if it's as detailed as that one. But you know what?
It's not. I'm going to tell you that the only test worth doing is the Kennedy-Krieger test. And it measures all these fatty acids. Body Bio have developed software to interpret it.
Nice.
It's the software from Body Bio. It's not the test. The test is Kennedy-Krieger.
Okay.
There's a research-based lipid panel.
Okay, Kennedy-Krieger.
Yeah, and it's the only one worth doing, but you've got to put it through the Body Bio software because they give you a nice one-page handout. Omega-6s, omega-3s, lipids, and do this, do that. It's the software that really orientates you to the test.
Well, listen, a test is not worth the paper it's on if you don't know what to do with it.
Exactly.
It's like literally there's no point doing it unless you're getting a roadmap with it. So, or somebody who knows how to interpret it. So, okay. So we measure those and then the high histamine foods. So that this now looks like the low hanging fruit. This is the easy stuff compared to dealing with your early childhood trauma that may or may not have happened from the time you were in the womb. And then dealing with mold, which, remediation is an ugly thing because half the time it doesn't work. Like once mold is in that environment, and it's like mold is probably one of the most well-adapted organisms on the face of the planet. Like it's insidious. So let's say we're kind of doing what we can for the mold. Getting away from the high histamine foods becomes the next thing. And these are the people who tell you, you say to them, well, listen, have some bone broth or have a protein shake. And they're like, what? I'm like, they go into like crisis just at the mention of these foods.
No bone broth, no fermented foods. They just like crash a person overnight.
And leftovers are a disaster for these people. And I live on leftovers, but I mean, like to them, leftovers it just is not okay.
You can freeze your food and then eat it the next day, but don't leave it in the fridge overnight. Yeah. Some people get away with it for 12 hours, but the very severe people, they know they can't do that, So we do, but I do paleo autoimmune low histamine, then add in the oxalates and, the FODMAPs if they have those issues. But it's usually paleo autoimmune low histamine, high fat.
Right.
We usually replace the lipids along with removing the inflammatory foods.
So replacing the lipids is a big deal. And this is the Body Bio stuff. This is restoring the cellular membrane integrity. So let's talk about that a little bit, what those lipids are. Yeah.
So I do the Body Bio fatty acid test. I do the IgL mitochondrial test. That test measures phosphatidylcholine and phosphatidylethylamine. The ethylamine is on the inner membrane of the mitochondria where your electron transport chain takes place. Mm-hmm. It also measures the body voltage. So if those phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethylamine body voltage are all affected, you've got to replace with phospholipids. Then the Body Bio fatty acid test measures the omega-6s and all the omega-3s and the myelinated fats and the omega-9s and the saturated fats. It measures all of them. Mm-hmm. So between that and the IgL mitochondrial test, I determine what needs to be done to repair mitochondria and move people out of the cell danger response, which takes 3 to 6 months to do. It's long. It's a long project.
Yeah, but there's a path to it, right?
There's a
And I
path.
think by the time people come to you, 3 to 6 months doesn't sound so bad when they've been suffering for years. I'm sure. So high fat. So you're saying high fat of the right fats kind of diet.
You've got to analyze what they're deficient in.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to replace that particular fat. So we have all these kind of oils that have different structures that replete, like primrose oil for, DGI. We've got different oils for different deficiencies.
Interesting.
So you choose your fat replacement accordingly.
That's amazing. So you're literally kind of going at it like rebuilding that cellular membrane to
Absolutely.
help it to regain function. And so do you see people actually start to stabilize at some point? Like, I mean, it sounds amazing, right?
Yeah,
like
no.
It must be for these people where they wake up one morning and all of a sudden they may not itch, or they don't have a rash, or
they get better. When the test starts improving, they feel better, and they repair their cell membranes, they repair the mitochondria, they stabilize the mast cells, usually with diet and mast cell stabilizers, which we haven't discussed. And then they stabilize their autonomic nervous system and amygdala, so they're not so twitchy and so reactive all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But
so you get all the things going. So let's talk about those mast cell stabilizers you said, right?
Yeah. So there's nutraceuticals, and we use the HisDAO enzyme, which we measure. There's a test from Precision Labs, measures DAO. There's a DAO enzyme you can get from any genetic profile as well to see if you have or don't have that gene. And we look at the HNMT gene to see if you break down histamine appropriately. We look at methylation, because a lot of methylation goes towards making phospholipids and breaking down histamine intracellularly. But what we do is we use DAO for the gut DAO. Yeah. We use quercetin and associated nutrients, including vitamin C. There's many others, black cumin seed and Nigella sativa and luteolin for nutraceuticals. We use those. But I usually go straight to pharmaceuticals. I go straight, and I get them all compounded, because if you go over the counter, you get all the excipients and dyes, which just make you worse, not better.
Well, yeah, you're talking about the most sensitive people on the planet here, so those things would destroy them for sure.
And I usually start with H1 blocker. I use a H1 like levocetirizine. You have to dose it twice a day, not once a day, even though it says it's 24 hours, not 24 hours. And if you don't dose it twice a day, you get breakthrough histamine flares. So we use H1 blocker, we use H2 blockers, and we use first generation H1 blockers at night called ketotifen. Mm-hmm. And ketotifen only stabilizes mast cells at night, but it's also a antihistamine, so you get nighttime coverage while you're sleeping. And then we go on to cromolyn a lot of the time. Cromolyn is like quercetin. It's a mast cell stabilizer, particularly for those people with food sensitivities and food reactions. And then we go on to montelukast or singular, which is for the asthma, the leukotrienes. And then there's a whole host of other pharmaceuticals you can use if you need to. But generally speaking, we get most of the work done doing that. But a lot of these very sick people, I can't take anything, I can't do anything, and they can't. And you've got to patients move to Calgary to be stabilized. We have to get them in a neutral environment. Some of our patients have developed mold-free, EMF-free homes where people stay.
Really?
Yeah. And then they stay for 3 to 6 months. And then they get IV mast cell intravenous stabilization to begin with while they're learning self-regulation. Then we add the oral supplements and mast cell stabilizers while they got IV coverage. And we're building a window of tolerance, building self-regulation, lowering the amygdala, building up the fats. They all speak to their nutritionist, Justine Stenger, who gets them on a paleo, autoimmune, low histamine, high-fat diet, if tolerated. Sometimes some people need more carbs. A lot of people need more protein as well.
Yeah.
But it's all done through a chronometer. We do the 8-day chronometer. We do the freestyle Libra blood sugar measurements. So we get everything regulated and try and get that system to stabilize and move them through the cell danger response, which is anywhere, as I said, from 6 months to a year sometimes.
Wow. Yeah. And so do people then, after this 6 months to a year work is done, do they then just go on their merry way and have a perfectly normal histamine mast cell stable life? Or are these people often, it's an ongoing journey, let's say?
It's an ongoing relationship with your body and mind, And yes, they move through the cell. They're no longer in cell danger response. They're not shut down. Mm-hmm. Functional. They're back at work. They're off disability. They
can live a life.
They can live. Their brain fog's lifted. They're concentrating. They can focus. They have energy. But then they always have to be hypervigilant for being exposed. They go on holiday. They go into a moldy hotel room. They go eat the buffet. They drink.
Histamine, yeah. Well, the moldy hotels are the worst, and you can't screen for those. The Airbnb site there's no sniff test.
People crash all the time from those sort of exposures, So they're always sensitive and vulnerable, but they get super educated and not to the point of neurosis, but they're just. I
was going to say hypervigilant is a bit of it's a trigger word, right? Because we just spent all this time saying they have to, you're helping them to retrain themselves not to be in constant sympathetic mode. So
it's conscious hypervigilance. They know if they walk into a hotel room and it smells musty, it's best they probably leave.
Yeah.
Whereas before they try and stick it out and they try and please the spouse or something,
Yeah. Yeah.
Now they just put their foot down. Honey, I'm out of here. I don't care what. We lose our deposit. I don't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they know.
Well, and by then probably their spouse or their partner knows, saying that they're trying to fight this is just
impossible.
It's a world of hurt, right? You're going to be dealing with a partner who's unhappy and miserable, and it is not going to be a romantic holiday. It's just not going to happen.
But we always try and make sure that the value systems of both partners are equally aligned and that the spouse comes to the educational trainings and sessions so that they get an understanding. Because it's very, if you have an avoidant spouse and an anxious, if they have different attachment styles, it can lead to a disaster. It can lead to marriages breaking up,
Well, for sure. And especially in a world where, a lot of this type of patient gets told by the conventional medical system that it's all in their head. And, what you said earlier, go see a psychiatrist, get out of your head, and you're going to be fine. And then if you have an unsympathetic or a spouse who doesn't get it,
family that's unsupportive. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It's going to make the problem worse. It's going to make you feel worse. It's just going to exacerbate the situation. So, to bring in the partner or family member or someone as a support person who can actually get their heads around understanding what's going on. Yeah. Not to mention allowing the person to feel safe with someone, right?
Yeah, they help co-regulate this they create this limbic resonance and co-regulation, which is extremely important in the beginning phases of treatment anyway. While people are getting back on their feet. I mean, I can't tell you how many people just end up crying in my office because they say, thank God, finally this makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm not crazy. I can't bear the rejection by all the health professionals. Everybody's trying to do their best, but it's just not in consensual reality. The full scope of this condition hasn't reached the academic institutions where it's now taught and used. It's still in its infancy. So it's a new way of looking at things.
Yeah, it is. And do you think it was around 40, 50 years ago, or is it really what you're talking about? It's the human body was not built to deal with this kind of crap, and it's just overload.
And toxins we exposed to. There's no question it's an escalating condition that's gotten worse decade to decade. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's think on that for a minute, ladies and gentlemen, and let's pull out our self-regulating devices, our brain taps and Newcoms and whatnots, our Sensates and Apollos. I mean, there's, I'm sure you see them, right? The number of devices that are out there right now, and never mind people with MCAS, just Joe Blow walking down the street. We know that if we can help people to get out of this constant state of
activation,
hanging on, and activation. I mean, if nothing else, it shuts down our immune system.
It does. Shifts the Th1, Th2 balance, goes through the roof. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we live in very challenging times, and we can't take resilience for granted anymore, and let alone all the political changes and all the cultural adjustments. And let's not go there.
Yeah, no, we can't even go there. No, and I mean, at this stage of the game, I think people are left in one of two camps. You've got the camp that's like taking up arms and saying, we have to do something about this, and they're taking it on. And we need people taking on whatever system is broken and trying to fix it. And then you get other people who are just kind of like keeping their heads down and going, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing over here and hope it goes away. But even for that person, and for both camps, the idea of self-regulation, the idea of building, and what you said it perfectly, building resilience in your system so that you can deal with the incoming all the time, and it doesn't directly affect you.
And building sanctuaries, finding a space that, when you sleep at night, you're not bombarded by your router that's, the amplifier that's under your pillow, or, the dirty electricity from your switch. We send building biologists into every patient's home to measure electrical fields, magnetic fields, radio frequencies, and dirty electricity. Because people with mast cell activation, which, by the way, electromagnetic fields amplify mold exposure dramatically.
Yeah.
They have to create sanctuaries. They have to eat impeccably. They have to sleep, and they have to create. Often they have to create Faraday cages with silver nets, and they have to turn off the electricity to their bedside lights, and turn off the routers, or have kill switches to their routers. And it's not neurotic. It's just makes sense. Smart.
It's just smart. I mean, having it, I'm moving into, like, I live in a very old house. And so I've been kicking and screaming because my husband decided, almost unilaterally, we're downsizing, we're leaving this house. And I'm like, no, I like my house, I don't want to go. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here thinking, and if he listens to this episode, he's going to come over and he's going to be, seriously, you said that? But we're moving into a home that was built 16 years ago. And I'm going to have a lot more options in terms of what I can and cannot do in this. Like, in this house, we're lucky to have electricity. In that house, there will be a breaker that's associated with the room that I can turn on.
Be careful that it's not a smart home with rigged up to every.
It's not. No, it's not. It's not that. I mean, and it's interesting, right? Smart homes, electric vehicles, all of this, like somebody, I think we went in to buy a dishwasher and a washing machine and a dryer. And they're like, oh, guess what? You can get these smart electronics and you can program it from the car. And I'm like, why would I even want to do that? Like, why would I want to bring more of this into my life? I don't need to tell my dishwasher to turn on when I'm in the car. I can turn it on when I get home. That's what buttons are for.
I do believe that we will evolutionarily adjust to the incoming toxic load and develop some resilience in our genetic machinery.
I like that line of thinking.
Yeah, I don't think we're doomed to sort of be extinct because of the incoming toxic load. I mean, yes, we've had periods of extinction, but there's a sort of, whenever we challenge, there's always an adjustment that we make, and we develop genetic mutations. Unfortunately, it is, the strong survive and the weak die off. It really does mount to that in the end. The ones who have resilience, good gene pools, they stay healthier and they survive better and longer. But we do have to adjust a whole new healthcare model of well-being as opposed to disease care.
Right.
There has to be a whole shift in consciousness and an awareness of environmental toxins and all these things. It'll come.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I do think that there'll be, I've heard it from a couple of people, this whole idea of, eventually non-native AMFs acting as a hormetic stressor, as long as you're not one of these electrically sensitive people, that the body can and will potentially adapt. But I would say that it will be able to do that better if we have healthier membranes, if we're eating better foods, if we're, if we're taking care of all those other things and limit the toxins, all those toxins, whether it's stress or EMF or food, and just give ourselves more buffer.
Human beings have value systems. We have relationships, we have social connections, we have health and well-being, we have mental health education, we have careers, and we have the making of money. And then we have our spiritual calling, what we're meant to do. Mm-hmm. We have to raise health as a very dominant value across the board.
Yeah.
We cannot take, absence of disease, forget about it. That's not health.
No. Yeah.
We know that. So when people come and see me for wellness medicine, you open the hood and they're just rife with all sorts of metabolic imbalances, So we've got to emphasize healthcare, and we've got to emphasize food and emphasize nutrition and stress response and sleep and, exercise and flexibility and movement. That must become the new model that we work towards. The disease care model has had its day.
Yeah.
And we don't want it to go away because we still want it there when we get diseases. But we've got to replace it with a whole new paradigm that has equal clout and validity and consensual reality. And it's not, those hippies over there, no, this is real. We've got to raise health as a value system and make it stand alongside disease care.
Well, and I think to do that effectively, it even has to be taught in schools. Like, it needs to be woven through the very fabric. Like, little kids, I know this when I've worked with families as a nutritionist, and when the little kids get on board, and they are like the Secret Service. These kids are relentless. Like, when you get them on side, nobody gets to stray. And they're awesome, but they have to be empowered and taught and given the tools.
And the next wave was, this whole Surgeon General of the United States issued something 2 days ago saying the exposure to social media and electromagnetics is definitely impeding children's mental health and well-being. It's gaining momentum, but we've got lobbyists who are fighting against all of it. So it's a big struggle. Maybe a century to evolve into a new paradigm, but it will eventually get there.
Yeah. And it comes down to the individuals, right? I think different parents, it's up to parents to make different choices for their kids, not buy them a cell phone when they're 4 and, those things, but it's going to be a process. And, but there's hope, right? I mean, that's the good news. And the good news is that, for people with MCAS, there's a sense of desperation until they come across people like you, doctors like you, who, it's not like you have all the answers, but you sure have figured out a bunch of it, and you can help them to get to a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This patient I saw this morning had no clue she had POTS. Not only she had POTS, she was a mast cell patient, 4 foods and reacting to angioedema, urticaria, reacts to everything. Said, are you dizzy when you stand up? Yes. I think I have POTS. I was told some time ago I had POTS. She did her blood pressure. She had POTS, like the worst case I've seen in a long time. And she just started putting more salt and water in her diet, and she's feeling 50% better. Just one little thing. Now, POTS isn't well recognized either. No. It's not well tested. They go for a tilt table test. You don't need a tilt table test. You just do 10 minutes of your blood pressure lying down. You lie down for 3 minutes, take your blood pressure pulse, stand up for 1 minute, take it again with the Omron, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If your pulse rate goes up over 30 beats per minute over that 10 minutes, or over 120 at any given time, you got POTS.
Really?
Yeah. Or if your systolic blood pressure drops more than 20, you've got orthostatic hypotension. If you don't treat that, you won't fix your mast cell activation. So POTS comes right up front and center.
And is that because it sends a signal to the nervous system, like shit's about to go bad? And therefore that puts you in that fight or flight, like it drives anxiety virtually, right?
It drives anxiety, it drives it, but it you don't perfuse your mitochondria or your brain because
and then there'd be that. Yeah.
You get hypoxia, hypovolemia. You feel awful.
Mm-hmm.
And they walk around sort of dizzy and can't stand up and feeling faint and palpitations, and POTS is ubiquitous, especially amongst that phenotype I mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground, sir.
Yeah, it's I love what I do, and it's very pleasant when you finally can help a person put a foot on the ground and stabilize their imbalances, and provide insight that my colleagues in traditional medicine, having come from medical school, we just don't learn this. It's all postgraduate exposure and interest of mine. That's why I know it. But
I was going to say, what sent you down this path? Like, how did you get here? Because you're classically trained MD, you went to med school.
I was interested as a young boy in how did people become the most evolved they could possibly be? So I was always curious from a very young age. What does it take to become self-actualized?
From a young age. All right. Okay. You've been around for a while. Okay.
Well, I read Jung, and I read about individuation, and then I got exposed to Indian, philosophies and things. So when I became an MD, I was like, these people are presenting with all these symptoms, but who are they really, and who do they wish to become? So then I started to just examine everything that could possibly help a person self-actualize and become who they're meant to be. And that led to every single, ology in the book. I had to go study everything. I still study. I just came back last night from ozone conference, learning ozone therapy.
Yeah, ozone's a very interesting area, especially when you're trying to, reduce toxic load in a person.
And treat mitochondrial issues.
Yeah. I have that podcast coming up too.
Just stay curious. You just stay, close to and you listen to your patients.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said one thing earlier that in the conventional system, there's no space allowed for this anymore. And it's that whole taking down a medical history with the patient. And that takes time.
But the person taking the history has to be exposed to a very wide range. There has to be a new curriculum of healer who gets exposed to a very wide range of ologies and sciences and methodologies, so that when they're sitting in front of a patient, they can go up and down layers and levels of healing, not just work at biochemistry and mechanistic medicine. They know if there's inherited trauma, if there's early defense structures, if there's, they can tell just by taking the history, but their diagnostic palette has to be very broad.
Yeah.
You can't be trained in N squared, D squared medical school only. They have to be curious about the human condition.
Yeah.
And they have a curriculum that exposes them to some of the core tenets of what it takes to diagnose and treat a complex patient.
Maybe your next job, she needs to be like starting a new med school of some kind.
My book is the new curriculum. I've written a book.
You have?
Yeah.
I should have that book.
Not published.
Well, when it's published.
I keep updating it when I learn new things.
Okay. At some point, you're just going to have to put your pen down and send it off to the publisher. And you can always do a version 2 or an addendum.
I get told that, but I sit down on a Friday night to start on chapter 4 revision, and then I get, a new podcast to listen to or something.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Okay. You know what? You're just going to have to give us what you got. And then you can always just give us more. How's that for an idea?
No, I've written this book, The New Curriculum, 7 Stages to Health and Transformation, a New Medical Curriculum. And that is the title of the book. It's based on the layers and levels of healing and how you need to amplify your diagnostic and therapeutic template. And I do wish to eventually have people fill in all the gaps of all the layers and levels that I've created, and then create a new curriculum for a new healer, for a new way of approaching complex illness.
Yeah. Well, I think that's brilliant. You just, the way to get the ball rolling, though, is to put that book out.
I've done small versions of it.
All right, whatever.
Need to get the big version.
Put out chapter by chapter if you have to, whatever. All right. Well, Dr. Hoffman, I thank you so much for today. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave the audience with? I mean, you've dropped a lot of wisdom on us, but anything else?
I just, I don't know if there's anything else to say, but if you read, for patients or anybody who's hearing, don't be tempted to find the latest diagnosis, the mold, the heavy metal. Just be careful of that. It's usually that plus 50 other things. That's number one. Number two, your body is the final resting place, not only of your own experiences, but your ancestral experience as well. So it may not have started with you, which is the title of one of my friends' book, Mark Wolin, who did family work. So it may not be what you think it is. And there may be a complexity that you haven't even imagined. And don't lose hope, because you will finally hit up, if you stay curious and you stay open, you will eventually, hopefully, meet up with somebody who can assist you on your transition path,
Yeah.
And so in the meantime, you may have to deal with, somebody who's got a little piece of the puzzle. Hopefully, over time, you can expand and meet people who've got a bigger piece of the puzzle, who can see the whole you and institute a whole person healing, not just POTS or not just SIBO or not just Lyme, we really need to have a very broad diagnostic palette when we're sitting in front of a person and listening to what they're trying to tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I actually interviewed a practitioner last year, and she said, almost without fail, the patient has the answer.
They do have a lot to.
They know. Like, they know everything changed when, or things have never been the same since, or it's just taking the time to, like in her case, that, she had one patient, she wasn't getting anywhere with her. She went back to her pages and pages and pages of notes and came across this one thing and said, "Oh, I missed that." Goes back, talks to the patient, and boom, it turned out to be a turning point for the practitioner and for the patient.
Yeah. And patients are very educated now. They're all over Google and whatnot. And they will come in and say, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? What about this? And 9 times out of 10, their suggestions are completely spot on.
Interesting. Well, they're living in that body, right?
Yeah, it's like, I got told today of a salt supplement for POTS that I hadn't heard of. So I go look it up quickly. He was right. That is a better option than one I was using.
There you go. And there's people making stuff all the time, right? So there's always something new.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Hoffman, where can people find you
I'm in Calgary.
You're
Hoffman
in Calgary.
Yeah.
So Hoffman Center, your website is hoffmancenter.com?
I don't even know.
Oh, come on.
I think if you Google Hoffman Center, it comes up. The title is Hoffman Center for Functional and Integrative Medicine, but I don't think you have to put that in. It's just Hoffman Center.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Calgary.
In Calgary, Alberta. This is in Canada, folks. No, this is not a U.S. doctor. This is one of our own in Canada. Very proud of him. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing. And we're looking forward to the book when you decide to share it with the rest of us.
No, I'll get it out for sure. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you.
Okay, bye now.